don't forget when you're going through your review list, think about how things fit together, how they relate. It's not enough to just simply jot down a few things. When you write an essay, you're gonna have to connect things. Connect your topics and relate it to a thesis and relate it to the essay. You have to get contacts. Think about how things relate. And that's why I kind of chunked it up the way the AP, the College Board divided it. I'm not, like, I don't personally would divide it that way. I didn't in my class, but I think it's time now, most of you are taking the test. I want you to be prepared. It does help. Oh, don't forget the review packets in. The ones in bold, if you answer those, that's, you have a chance to get a high B, as long as you answer them correctly. Those will put some time in it. And then the ones that aren't bold, the more you do those, the chance for a higher grade. That's, I go through and I decide, I grade. And starting in a couple of weeks, I will start doing review sessions. And I would take 2 nights at least. And I'll take time in the evening. We all can come in and we can review. Last year we had almost everyone was able to come to at least one of them. And it helps immensely. Go through that list, talk about a few things, talk about thesis statements, go through a few facts. It does help a lot. And it's fun. Actually, it's kind of cool getting together. It really is. I think that's only one, isn't it?
It's fuzzy too. Like long 11, that's wrong.
Who else sees 2? You're clairvoyant. Do we get the Bretton Woods? Do we get to hear? All right, let's do Bretton Woods real quick. So we got NATO, we got Berlin Airlift. Oh, what is the foreign policy at this time? Yeah, the Truman Doctrine. And every communist revolt begins where? And therefore, it is if there's a victory for communism, who wins?
Stalin.
Yeah, Stalin wins, the Soviets. So Bretton Woods is a really important thing to happen. It's upstate New York. It's actually a resort there, Bretton Woods. I've not been there, so I stole the picture from somebody else of the sign talking about the conference there. But it's, I guess, beautiful. Upstate New York, I've been there. It's beautiful. Just, mountains. It rains there, so there's lots of running streams and there's trees and it's green. We're going to be green for a while, I think. Of course, last year I was talking to seniors about this. Last year when they had the AP exam, it was snowing. Or I'm sorry, the ACT test, it was snowing. And it did. We had snow the last time the last week of April. So this is not a lot different, even though I do want it to end. Are you with me on that? I want fire season to begin. Moving on. And so what they went there this week, after the war, we need a stable financial system. And they knew that everybody's finances are going to be in chaos, especially like Germany and Japan. They're going to have to essentially rebuild everything. And the gold standard, which was problematic during World War I, was a dismal failure by the Great Depression, and everybody acknowledged that they couldn't probably go back to the gold standard. So what they decided here is, and it would be for the next almost 30 years, the entire world's, outside the Soviet Union, world's financial system will be based upon the dollar. Everybody's value of their currency will be pegged to the dollar. So the idea being that the dollar will back up other currency. And then the dollar can be transferred, can be exchanged for gold. So it's not quite the gold standard, but it's similar. And the reason they could do this is because the rest of the world was in shambles. The United States economy was almost as big as the rest of the world combined after the war. And gives you an idea how much the rest of the world will be devastated by this. And the United States will be living off this this scale, this size advantage for years through now still. And a couple things about it then. Also, every country, their financial advisors basically say we're going to have to develop Keynesian economics. and the concept of social democracy. The United States has done an element of social democracy. Western Europe and Japan are varying degrees of social democracy. And what that means is it's Keynesian economics to try to promote demand, get wages up, but also use some socialist ideas to stabilize capitalism, to avoid some of the follies of the boom and the bust. And so use some socialist ideas. For example, the US did that, still does that. What is the old age pension? Well, what is it called? Social Security. And it is an element of kind of the socialist prescription. Now, this was a socialist prescription to try to stabilize capitalism so it could survive. And so Western Europe is going, and Japan are going to do this. But all these states will either strengthen or have or start some kind of pension fund. Everyone except for the United States would do health insurance for everybody. In some way, some stronger than others, and different styles. Every state did something different. Every state except the United States would do this at first, but then it would go away. It would have free or very low cost college tuition, and also other government aid. With the idea being, and this is the thing you have to put down, they wanted this. The big thing is so fascism doesn't develop again. So fascism doesn't develop like it did in the austerity of the Great Depression, and we can see some of these areas that are going through austerity and fascism's on the rise. Also to avoid communism, but their big fear in 1944 was fascism. 1950, they're also talking communism. And in the 1970s, Bretton Woods would break down. There'd be a rise of conservatism and conservative economics trickle down. And this will be called in the United States and elsewhere, this rise of conservatism as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is actually conservative economics. I know I told you earlier that the New Deal of Keynesian was called liberalism or liberal in the United States, but elsewhere, like in Europe, what we call conservatism was called liberalism. It just was. These are just titles. And so neoliberalism, in fact, significant numbers of both Democrats and Republicans after the 1980s would be neoliberal. President Biden was for most of his career. President Obama was neoliberal when it comes to economics, meaning pretty conservative. Okay, so post-war. In the United States, first up, we got to get the GI Bill. The GI Bill would be passed near the end of World War II, and this was Roosevelt's last really big New Deal program over the opposition of conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats. It was passed. And this was, it provided two things for veterans. And there's going to be nearly 15 million men and women who are veterans of World War II. It provided two things. The first one, it paid for most of college. So this was a massive benefit for those veterans. Remember, Roosevelt wanted college tuition as part of the third New Deal, but that failed. And so this would provide it for veterans. This would be huge. College would have been way too expensive for most people coming back from the war or any time before the war. But now, because they were a veteran, they could go to college. And this would help fuel the economic growth of the 1950s through the 1970s. Think about all these well-educated people willing to adapt to a changing society. Education does that. And number two, it provided home insurance, homeowners insurance for veterans. So it aided veterans in buying homes. And even though the law and by executive order, it was not to discriminate based upon color of skin, it did. But not as much as other programs. It greatly benefited all veterans. And this will be one of the big reasons, as we mentioned before, why so many people volunteer for the armed forces now. Armed forces is a massive commitment, but it still does provide help with home, but the big thing is college. So this was a half effort. They got this through. Usually conservatives are opposed to this. This is because it goes against conservative economics. All right. But after the war, there's going to be a post-war depression. Not as bad as World War I. World War I was horrific, but prices began to explode. Once they got rid of the price controls, it took a couple years to switch from military goods to consumer goods. You can't just automatically go from making Sherman tanks to Plymouths or Chevrolets. It takes a while to change production. And so that took a while. And so all the prices for cars or everything else went up, but it was not near as bad as after World War I. And the GI Bill helped with that. Veterans of the war weren't immediately unemployed. A lot of them could say, well, the job market's kind of rough, but I can go to college. It's going to blew them away. End quote.
So conservatives, the Trump party, the Democrats, like this, and it's because they do that thing that people are wait for.
They didn't let it pass. Most of them voted against. So most conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats voted against. And so it wasn't so much letting it pass, they just didn't have enough votes. And enough kind of people in the middle of both parties got passed. A lot of Southern Democrats were opposed because it might violate Jim Crow laws. Remember the segregation laws? And so, but don't forget, as I mentioned before, the Republicans, okay, they didn't quite sweep, I exaggerated there. I was looking for a word, I came up with sweep, but they did really well in 46 midterm. Even took over a slight majority in the House and a lot of state governments. And so Truman would go from being really popular when the war ended to being blamed for the bad economy, to being blamed for issues of the Cold War. And Truman would go to being almost a joke overnight, which of course you can imagine a guy like Truman, it just drove him nuts. Well, one important law would be passed. Once conservatives took power, they hammered at the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, before you write down anything else, write down it weakened the Wagner Act. Remember, the Wagner Act was the New Deal Act that allowed for labor unions. Because conservative, especially conservative economics, are violently opposed to labor unions. Remember, that's why they loved Mussolini and Hitler. Well, okay, they didn't realize Hitler was more, but they liked fascism because it got rid of labor unions. So it was intensely anti-union, made it more difficult for unions to organize, and took away their best strike, a sit-down strike. In the winter of 36, General Motors workers in Flint, Michigan went to work, and then those who wanted a better contract literally sat down in the factory and wouldn't allow scabs or strike breakers in. It was really effective. The United Auto Workers got their contract. That's now illegal. Truman vetoed it, but they overrode it. So they got the 2/3 necessary. There was a conservative economics, or there's very conservative economic, more trickle down. And this would erode unions. Democrats would, for years, until the Democrats kind of got more neoliberal in the 70s, always said they're going to override it, but never have. And it's still the law of the land. And that's part of the reason why beginning in the 1980s, union membership would drop. And today union membership is the lowest it has been since before the 20th century. Yes. Right. And yeah, but nationwide union membership is really low. But yeah, I'm a part of a union, as I mentioned before. There's a teachers union. And so that's Taft-Hartley Act. And so the election of 1948, it really looked like Truman was done. In fact, Truman would get the nomination, but he actually didn't want it until people said he couldn't do it. Then it's like, I'll show you. But Democrats actually, at their convention, tried to get somebody else. Now, his program's going to be the fair deal. Sound familiar? So he's going to finish the New Deal. Truman was a New Deal. He was a Southerner, and that's part of the reason that Southern Democrats kind of forced him on Roosevelt in 44. Roosevelt, this would be his third vice president. Truman was his third. He didn't really care. He, as I think most people couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that he could die because he was so ill. He just Didn't want to believe it. And I should say one thing about Truman. He even went to the commander of Western Allied forces in Europe and soon to be the commander of what's the military alliance that the United States is going to create after the Berlin airlift? NATO. His name was Dwight Eisenhower. He asked Eisenhower, would you be willing to take the Democratic nomination? I'll step aside. You'll get it. Eisenhower had never really even voted. He didn't know what party he was. He knew he was from Kansas. They're mostly Republicans, but he kind of thought about it and said, nah, I don't want to be president. The irony is what? Yeah. He would eventually decide, I'm a moderate Republican. And he would run for president, become president in 52. Yeah. So Truman's in. Now remember the third New Deal that Roosevelt couldn't get. This is very similar. The three big things, education. So build on the GI Bill to either provide tuition support or give tuition. So build on that, but also to provide direct aid to communities, 1st through 12th, elementary and high school. You notice I didn't say kindergarten. Kindergarten was not really that, it was more just kind of like it was kind of disorganized outside the school system and people just voluntarily sent. Isn't that kind of weird? Because now, kindergarten is, it's mandatory. It's part of the system. And you just have to, when I was in elementary school, most places in Montana, kindergarten was not mandatory and it was happening. Yeah, but they still did like school. But yeah, happening. It seems so weird now. And so with that, next, national healthcare insurance. So this would be built on the payroll taxes and Social Security. Now, this is not a national healthcare system. So it would not be hospitals or doctors. They would not be working for the government unless it was a publicly owned hospitals. They would still be private or nonprofit, which existed then, or city-owned hospitals. Doctors would still be independent, but the health or doctors, nurses, but the insurance would be provided by one entity, the government. And it would be paid for through additional to the payroll tax. It's very similar to a system that a country very close to us would adopt about 15 years after this, 20 years after this. What's that? Say it again. What country? You know? Canada, yes. Yeah, it's called single payer. It's not like Great Britain. Great Britain, they would do their health care insurance, and the government would just take over the healthcare system. It's like the most beloved thing in Britain, their national healthcare. Canada, every province has their own. Every province provides health insurance for everybody. To every province in Canada. This would have been national. I should add other countries do the single payer, like France and Germany. They have private insurance companies, but they're mandated to provide everybody insurance. Everyone has a different way. The U.S. does not have national health insurance. And then, of course, civil rights. And I've had one big thing. This is a Southern Democrat who grew up in Jim Crow, Missouri. And he is pushing for ending Jim Crow. And in fact, in 1948, he desegregated the military. He ended segregation in the armed forces. Everyone got that. They've gone from the separate units for black soldiers and white soldiers and said they ordered them to be integrated, opened up the military academies to all races, force officers, candidate school, or any other branch or pilot training to everybody, regardless of color of skin. And this would infuriate some of the military. And there was a strong military tradition in the South. So a lot of the officers were Southern, and they said this would never work. There's no way black and white soldiers can fight together. There'd be too much racial animosity. And this was, of course, proven 1000% incorrect. Very quickly, because there's going to be a war very quickly. Where? It's coming. And today, the most integrated body in the entire United States is the armed forces. Nothing that's more integrated. Not only based upon color of skin, but also by basis of sex or sexual preference. There's nothing. Why? Because they ordered it. This is the way it is going to be. I'm not saying there's not problems down, that won't be problems, but it is kind of amazing. It worked really well. It's proved desegregation is incorrect. But you can imagine there'd be some anger. So Truman will be at the nominating convention. Southern Democrats went to the convention, but they're angry. And when Truman demanded a civil rights plank ending Jim Crow, and Northern Democrats were all behind it as a group, they left. Southern Democrats, and this is them walking out, they went out by state and they stormed out. Yes, that's the flag of Mississippi. Remember the Lost Cause? They adopted the Confederate battle flag on it. It was called the Lost Cause mythology. They walked out and formed, or they split over civil rights and formed a party. I should have made this bold, but they called it the States' Rights Party. And remember, before the Civil War, states' rights was code for pro-slavery. Now it's code for pro-Jim Crow. It's code for segregation. Everybody knew it. In fact, they called themselves the Dixiecrats. And they nominated the governor of South Carolina. There he is, Strom Thurmond. And do you remember the Dixiecrats? I got to type something really quick. I forgot to send a result email. I'm sorry, I just remembered. Let's do this. The Dixiecrats, right after the Civil War, remember presidential reconstruction? Those Confederates were sent back to Congress. They called themselves the Dixiecrats. So they're not hiding what they believed in. Strom Thurmond, and they once again dusted off the Confederate battle flag, the Lost Cause now, and brought it for the states' rights book as this hastily made one-term party with the Confederate battle flag. And everybody knew what that meant. The Confederate battle flag became a symbol for Jim Crow or segregation. And so you had that out, everybody knew what you were talking about. And that is why, to this day, you might find some people who might not appreciate the Confederate battle flag. Now, this was not an organized party. They just quick ran it. This is not here. Has this happened? You remember when? Yeah, I remember. You're right. Well, there was a constitutional union party, but the Democrats split with Northern and Southern Democrats. Remember 1860? And Lincoln could win because the Democrats were split. What do you think the Republicans are doing watching this? Not only that, there were a group of Democrats who thought Truman wasn't going far enough and he was going to blow the world with the Truman Doctrine. And they left too. Yes.
So I want the Democrats to quit, I would become a Republican and split the Republican.
Yeah, or vice versa. Remember, we have a winner-take-all system. And so if there's a third party, it takes away votes from somebody else. That's why we have two parties. And that's why, we always have two parties. Doesn't necessarily mean there'll be Democrats or Republicans, but we have two parties for that reason. Which, don't they skip a lot of people? I mean, there's issues with that. But that's why. There'll never be a third party that would be anything more than a minor party because of the two-party system. Now, remember, the Whigs died, the Federalists died, but so, I should add Strom Thurmond. He would become one of the leaders then of the fight against equal rights until he would finally retire from the U.S. Senate in 2003 at the age of 101. Oh, he was a determined fighter against equal rights. Now, if you're not clear, this is what his speech accepting their nomination. If it's not clear. Now, let me add one more thing. So a term that essentially meant black, even though it just sounds awkward. I think you understand why, was Negro was used all the time. And that was seen as the more formal, polite way to say somebody of African descent. But that was the Southern way of saying it. It was kind of the accent, saying instead of Negro. But you also can see how this is almost saying something else. So it was a way to kind of say it and say, well, I'm not saying that because of you're mocking my accent. And so that would be used. And so that's what it meant Negro, but I put that in there because I want to show that accent. And here they are, the Confederate battle flag, holding up a picture. You see it right there. You might recognize who that is. Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. He's one of their heroes. And so this was a big deal. And Strom Thurmond in 1964 would leave the Democratic Party and become the first major Democrat to leave the Democrats and go to the Republicans over civil rights. And would become a Republican then for the next, well, almost 40 years. So he'd begin that exodus. And the exodus would begin in this, you'd see it really begin in the 60s and then explode by the 1980s. So we're not done. Other Democrats were mad that Roosevelt wasn't going far enough and fearful of World War III. And they left and tried to reestablish the old progressives. And they formed another party. So they brought back the old progressive name. Henry Wallace would be their nominee. Henry Wallace was the Secretary of Agriculture. He was a progressive or liberal Republican. He became Roosevelt's second vice president, but was ousted by Southern Democrats, demanded he be gone in 1944. And he's going to run for president saying that Truman's going too far in the Truman Doctrine, and they should do more for civil rights. They should do more for voting rights. He also wanted something that had been lying dormant. Wallace wanted the Equal Rights Amendment, so no discrimination based upon sex. He wanted that added too. And so here shows now the Democrats are divided by three. Here's Truman trying to guide the Republican plowing. And here's Wallace saying, ha, and that was the way, for those of us who plowed fields, right? You go ha to the mule, that means go left. If you go G and you see it's Thurman, you go right. So the more conservative or right, like Thurman, or the more liberal or left, like Wallace. So the Republicans are in good shape. I should add that Wallace, when he ran, he might have been right about the Truman Doctrine nearly leading to World War III because it nearly did. We're almost going to have it here pretty soon. But he also, part of the rhetoric was that Stalin wasn't that bad. Stalin was really bad in a lot of ways. Yes, they exaggerated the threat to Stalin, but that would hurt his credibility. So the Republicans nominated Thomas Dewey. He ran against Roosevelt in 1944, didn't win. He was a liberal Republican, former Attorney General and District Attorney of New York. And he broke up a couple of the mobs, organized crime. And so he was really famous. Conservative Republicans were furious though, because he did not fully attack the New Deal. I should add, he kind of looked like the little man on the wedding cake. That's what he used to joke about him. And all they thought was, we adopt this man who really actually couldn't speak, he couldn't smile. Supposedly the photographer kept saying, smile for this famous cover of Time magazine, and that's the best smile he could give. Was that it hurts him? He really wasn't a dynamic candidate. But all they had to do was show up, right? The Democrats are so split. Now there were polls. There's more political polls than ever before in 1948. And every poll, this cartoon references, there's Dewey talking to Truman, as not just a victory for the Republicans, but a Republican sweep. The Republicans are going to do a landslide. Every poll. In fact, it was basically acknowledged that Truman will lead to a humiliating defeat for the Democrats and the rise of Republicans. It really did seem like that, especially the way that the Democrats were split. There's no way that Truman can win. So they're literally about ready to run. They're literally about ready. And what they do is this: if you're vice president like Truman was, and it won't count as a term if you serve less than 3 years of that term that you replace. And so if you serve less than 3 years, then you can run for 2.5 years. Roosevelt or Truman actually served more than 3 years. But he, since he was already president, he could have. Remember that term grandfather clause? Remember that? They were going to use grandfather. I should ask one more thing too. This is the first campaign of television. Television was just starting and they broadcast both conventions. And the Democrats were really humiliated by the, Southern Democrats walking out, as you can imagine. This is the last campaign where you still have the old style, early 20th century campaigning of speeches, and it's about ready to be replaced with television. And the next one will be commercials and the thing we have now. It's coming. So this is the last of the old early 20th century elections. The only person who thought Truman could win was this man right here. Truman understood something very important. The people really like the New Deal. And the Republicans are running against the New Deal. They're running against Social Security. The people love Social Security. They're running for child labor. People didn't want child labor. They're running against the minimum wage. People want the minimum wage. They have weak unions, but they like their unions. He knew that. He knew how popular it was. And he went around the country and spoke directly to them. He rode his train ever, including through Montana. And in every little town, he'd give it what's called a whistle stop. The train would blow the whistle, he'd give a speech from the back of his train called the Ferdinand Magellan, which is a great. And he would give speeches. He wasn't a great, set speech maker, give an organized speech. But what he could do is, are you done? You're done? I'm not done. Because I got a couple more things to do. And with that, he could give kind of like this rabble-rousing speech. And those Republicans, they want to bring back the 20s. They want to bring back the wealth, the greed that led to the Great Depression. These malefactors, which means evil doers of wealth, are coming back. And somebody would always yell, became a thing. They yell, "Give them hell, Harry!" And he would say, "You send me back and I will." They all would cheer. He attacked them. While the Republicans said nothing. They just assumed we don't screw up, we win. When the election finally happened, it would be one of the biggest political upsets. Considered at the time the biggest political upset in history. Nobody expected Truman or the Democrats to do well. The Democrats, as a whole, rolled in this election. Truman won a massive victory, even though Wallace got over 1 million votes, Thurman got over 1 million votes, and Thurman won these southern states. It's hard to imagine a bigger upset than this. Yes, Henry. Because one of their electors voted for Thurman. The other 11 voted for Truman. They weren't necessarily plunged. The Chicago Tribune, which was someday this will break again. Did that scare you? The Chicago Tribune, which was a relatively pro-Republican newspaper, they wanted to get the extra out, and you'll be the first one out. So they have this famous headline. This is in the textbook. I imagine a lot of you seen this picture. Truman got that. He's, yeah. Well, now the Republicans are mad. And they decide, literally, we're going to get dirty. And they're going to begin to red paint. They're going to attack Democrats for letting the communists win. And in 49, two things are going to happen that will allow this. There'll be 2 shocks of 49 that will literally blow everything up. And it made sure that none of the proposals of the fair deal would pass. Southern Democrats joined Republicans to pass them both. And the first one they tried, they really thought they'd get health insurance. And Southern Democrats said no. Why? Because that implies blacks will be in the same hospitals. And that's why there's no health insurance. Same thing for tuition. Blacks will be in the same schools. And that's why that didn't happen. That's why it blew up. One of those great what ifs. What are the two shocks? Yes, they involved the Soviet Union. Shock number one. Well, the United States was doing testing in the atmosphere. Remember blowing up islands? What was that first island we blew up I talked about? So they hadn't done tests for a while in 49, but they're seeing about the long range effects of radiation. How long does it stay in the atmosphere? They're actually sending balloons up to 100,000 feet of top secret program to read radiation at that level of the atmosphere. Top secret. One of these would crash. New Mexico. This top secret balloon at this place called Roswell. But moving on. Has anyone heard about the UFO stories in Roswell? Yeah. Joe 1. They discovered radiation in the atmosphere. And the US hadn't exploded a bomb for a while. That meant only one thing. The Soviets had exploded a bomb. Nobody else had did. Britain was still a year away. France was about 4 years away. Nobody else exploded. And we dubbed it Joe 1 after Stalin. No, the Soviets did not call their bomb Joe 1. Here is the actual explosion. It's in Kazakhstan. Here is a model of it, and it's exactly the copy of Trinity. And all of a sudden, overnight, we've gone from being, okay, so the Red Army's strong, but we still have the bomb, to the vision of fleets of Soviet bombers laying radioactive waste to our cities. Overnight. All of a sudden, we begin to prepare civil defense. This is where we get the famous duck and cover, which, yes, I did when I was in elementary school, hide under a desk in case of nuclear war. That'll work. Nuclear survival handbooks went out. The threat overnight. We thought the Soviets were big, clunky with big fingers. They couldn't do that kind of stuff. Yeah, they said big fingers. That always makes me laugh. Well, why they do it? Spies. Last thing we got to write down for today. There was a spy. He was a Bulgarian physicist who fled fascism. He went to Britain. And in Britain farmed him out to Los Alamos, with the idea being he'll go back to Britain and help work on this bomb. He was working on the British bomb when Joe 1 was exploded. His name was Klaus Fuchs. Please be careful spelling his name. Are we good on that? Okay. And the United States had all this coded material from the Soviet Union during World War II. They wrote the Soviet World War II code in 49. And as they're going through it, they found the schematics for the Trinity bomb and his name all over it. He sent it. He gave it to spy. He was the worst type of spy. He believed it. He was a true believer. He was a socialist. And he thought fascism is eventually going to take over the United States. The only way to stop that, Stalin needs the bomb. Which, yeah, I know, but he believed it. Gee, I wonder if Britain was embarrassed. You have a review packet. Oh, I didn't get a chance to read it. I said it this time. Actually, I'm going to grade this after school. I'm going to have it tomorrow. Oh, rodeo?
I got it in a little voice so I can make it well.
That is awesome. That is very cool. You're a fan. 100%. That's pretty fun. About time you got here. Say goodbye to the, I'm turning the recording on. Say goodbye.